The year was 1873, and the Arizona Territory stretched endlessly under a merciless sun that bleached bones white and turned men's hearts harder than the red rock canyons. In this unforgiving land, where Apache warriors still rode the wind and settlers fought daily battles against nature itself, a girl with eyes like storm clouds and skin bronzed by desert sun would challenge everything the townspeople of Willowbrook believed about civilization, family, and what it truly meant to be human. They called her savage, but Thomas McKinnon would discover that sometimes the most beautiful souls are hidden beneath the roughest exteriors, and that the greatest acts of courage happen not on battlefields, but in the quiet moments when strangers choose love over fear. Thomas McKinnon stood on his ranch porch that morning, watching a lone figure appear on the ridge overlooking his property. The weathered rancher had lived in Apache territory long enough to recognize when he was being observed. The figure sat motionless on a painted pony, studying his land with the patience of a predator. Thomas had seen raids before, knew the signs of danger, but something about this watcher felt different, smaller, more cautious than threatening. For 3 days, the mysterious observer returned to the same ridge, always at dawn, always disappearing before the sun reached its peak. Thomas found evidence of their presence near a natural spring on his land, carefully arranged stones, the remains of a rabbit dinner, and tracks made by small moccasins. Someone was living rough in the wilderness, someone skilled enough to survive alone in country that claimed the lives of experienced frontiersmen. On the 4th evening, as Thomas checked his horses in the corral, he found his answer. A young Apache girl stood at the fence, her hand extended toward his mare Buttercup. She couldn't have been more than 11 years old, with long black hair hanging in tangled strands and wearing a tattered calico dress that had once been blue. When Thomas cleared his throat softly, she spun around with the fluid grace of a wild animal, her dark eyes wide with fear and defiance. They stared at each other across the moonlit yard, neither moving. Thomas slowly set his rifle aside and raised his empty hands, trying to convey peace without words. The girl took a step backward, then another, melting into the shadows as silently as she had appeared. The next morning brought evidence of her desperation. Someone had taken corn, tomatoes, and a small pumpkin from his vegetable garden. Rather than feeling angry about the theft, Thomas felt oddly pleased. If she was hungry enough to risk approaching his house, perhaps she could be convinced to accept help more directly. Thomas made a decision that would have seemed foolish to most of his neighbors. He prepared a meal of beans, cornbread, and jerked beef, then carried it to the spring where he had found her makeshift camp. He placed the wrapped bundle on a flat rock and returned to his house, hoping she would understand the gesture. The food was gone the next morning, replaced by a small woven grass basket no bigger than his fist. Inside were 3 white stones, polished smooth by running water, and a single eagle feather. Thomas had lived on the frontier long enough to understand the significance of such a gift. The girl was expressing gratitude, trust, and perhaps most importantly, a desire for continued contact. This pattern continued for a week. Each evening, Thomas left food by the spring. Each morning, he found it gone, replaced by some small token: healing herbs, a piece of quartz crystal, or a delicately carved wooden bird. The girl was not only surviving in the wilderness, she was creating beauty in the midst of hardship. On the 7th day, Thomas decided to take a greater risk. Instead of leaving the food and departing, he settled on a fallen log near the spring and waited. The sun set in spectacular fashion, and still he waited. When the girl finally appeared at the edge of the clearing on her painted pony, they studied each other in silence for what felt like hours. Finally, she slipped down from her horse and walked slowly toward the rock where he usually left her food. Thomas could see her more clearly now in the starlight. She was painfully thin, her dress torn and mended with strips of other garments. Despite her obvious skills at survival, she had the hollow-eyed look of someone who lived constantly on the edge of hunger. When their eyes met across the clearing, Something passed between them that transcended language and cultural differences. The girl unwrapped the food and began to eat with the focused intensity of someone who never knew when the next meal might come. When she finished, she looked at Thomas again and spoke. Her voice was soft but clear, speaking accented English that suggested she had learned the language from someone who cared enough to teach her properly. "You are the man with the gentle horses," she said. "I am," Thomas replied carefully. "My name is Thomas McKinnon." The girl considered this solemnly. "I am called Ayana," she said, "but the people in the town call me Savage." The pain in her voice when she spoke that cruel word made Thomas clench his fists in anger. "Ayana," he repeated, trying to pronounce it correctly. "That's a beautiful name. What does it mean?" For the first time, something that might have been a smile touched her mouth. "It means eternal blossom," she said. "My grandmother chose it because I was born in spring, when the desert flowers were blooming." Thomas felt his heart shift as he recognized this moment when his life would take an unexpected turn. This child possessed a dignity and grace that many adults never achieved. She had survived hardships that would have broken grown men, yet she spoke of eternal blossoms and showed gratitude for simple kindness. "Where is your family, Ayana?" Thomas asked gently. The girl's expression grew distant. "They are gone," she said simply. "The soldiers came to our village last winter. There was sickness and fighting and fire. My grandmother hid me in a cave and told me to wait for her return. I waited many days, but she never came back." Thomas felt tears burning his eyes as he imagined this child alone in a cave, waiting for a grandmother who would never return. "How long have you been alone?" Ayana looked up at the stars. "Since the snows melted," she said. "I tried to find others from my village, but they were gone, some dead, some taken to the reservation. I came here because my grandmother said good grass and water meant good people might live here too." The simple faith in her words struck Thomas like a physical blow. This child had survived months in the wilderness based on her grandmother's wisdom about judging character by the quality of a person's land. "You cannot stay out here alone," Thomas said. "Winter will come soon, and this is no place for anyone without shelter." Ayana's expression grew wary. "I cannot go to the reservation," she said firmly. "They make people forget who they are." Thomas had heard similar stories about the government's brutal assimilation policies. "I am not talking about the reservation," he said carefully. "I am talking about my ranch. You could stay there, help me with the animals and garden. I have been alone for a long time, and I could use the company." Ayana stared at him as if he had suggested something impossible. "You would let me stay, even though I'm Apache?" The question revealed so much about what this child had experienced. "Especially because you are Apache," Thomas said. "You know things about this country that I am still learning. You can survive in places that would kill most people. Any man would be lucky to have you as a partner." The word partner seemed to surprise her. "You would treat me as an equal, not as a servant?" Thomas felt anger at the implications of her question. "I would treat you as family," he said, "because that is what you would be." Ayana was quiet for so long that Thomas worried he had pushed too hard. Finally she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "I remember what family feels like, but I thought I would never have it again." Thomas stood slowly and extended his hand. "You do not have to decide tonight, but the offer stands. There is a room in my house that has been empty too long, and a life that has been too quiet for too many years." Ayana looked at his outstretched hand, then touched his fingers briefly with her own. Her skin was rough from exposure, but her touch was gentle, almost reverent. "I will think about it," she said, "but I cannot leave my pony. He is all I have left of my old life." Thomas smiled genuinely for the first time in months. "Any family of mine includes their horse. I have plenty of room in the corral." The next evening, Ayana returned with her decision and something unexpected. A second horse, a sturdy bay mare that Thomas recognized as belonging to Jim Patterson, a neighboring rancher who had died 3 months earlier in what appeared to be a fall from his horse. "I found her wandering in the mountains," Ayana explained. She was hurt and hungry. I took care of her because no one else would." Thomas looked at the mare, noting the careful attention paid to healing what had been a serious leg injury. "You did exactly right," he said. Jim Patterson was a good man, and he would be glad to know his horse was being cared for by someone who understood her needs. They walked back to the ranch together, Ayana leading both horses while Thomas carried her few possessions: a worn leather bag that had belonged to her grandmother, a bow and quiver of arrows, and a blanket woven in traditional Apache patterns. It was not much to show for 11 years of life, but Thomas could see that each item was precious to her. Thomas showed Ayana to the spare bedroom, watching her reaction as she took in the clean bed, the window overlooking the mountains, and the small dresser for her belongings. "This is mine?" she asked, wonder filling her voice. "This is yours," Thomas confirmed, "for as long as you want it to be." Ayana set her grandmother's bag carefully on the dresser, then turned to face Thomas with tears shining in her dark eyes. "I do not remember the last time I slept in a real bed, or the last time someone was kind without wanting something in return." Thomas felt his own eyes growing misty. "You do not owe me anything, Ayana. A family takes care of each other because that is what families do." The first weeks required patience and adjustment from both of them. Ayana was unused to living indoors, often sleeping on the floor beside her bed rather than in it. She was deeply suspicious of locked doors and windows, needing to know she could escape quickly if danger threatened. Thomas solved this by showing her how to open every window and door, assuring her that nothing would ever be locked that she could not open from inside. Mealtimes were initially challenging. Ayana had grown accustomed to eating quickly and irregularly, always ready to abandon food and flee if necessary. It took time for her to trust that food would be there whenever she was hungry, and that no one would take it away. The girl's knowledge of the land amazed Thomas daily. She could predict weather changes hours before his instruments showed any signs of shifting conditions. She knew which plants could be used for medicine and which were poisonous, and she had an intuitive understanding of animal behavior that helped them locate lost cattle and injured horses with remarkable efficiency. Most importantly, Ayana brought a sense of purpose to Thomas's life that he had not realized he was missing. For the first time in years, he looked forward to waking up, curious to see what new wonder the girl might reveal about the world around them. The first real test came when Thomas needed to go to town for supplies. Willowbrook was barely more than a trading post, general store, saloon, and a few scattered houses, but it was the center of social life for scattered ranchers and farmers in the area. "I have to go to town today," Thomas told her over breakfast. "We need flour and sugar. You can stay here if you want or come with me." Ayana looked up from her eggs thoughtfully. "Will people there call me savage?" Thomas felt the familiar surge of anger. "Some might, but not when I am around, and not twice." Ayana nodded slowly. "I think I should come. If I am to be part of your family, then I should not hide from the world." They made the 12-mile journey to Willowbrook under a bright autumn sky. Ayana sat beside Thomas wearing a new dress he had ordered from the catalog, her long black hair neatly braided and adorned with a blue ribbon. She looked like what she was, a well-cared-for child who happened to be Apache. The reaction in town was immediate and predictable. Conversation stopped when they pulled up in front of the general store. Mrs. Henderson, the store owner's wife, emerged with her mouth set in a disapproving line. "Thomas McKinnon," she said in a voice that could have frozen water in July. "What exactly do you think you are doing?" Thomas removed his hat and nodded politely, but his voice carried a warning. "Good morning, Mrs. Henderson. I am doing my shopping, same as always. I would like you to meet my daughter, Ayana." The use of the word daughter sent a visible shock through the small crowd that had gathered. Mrs. Henderson's eyes narrowed as she looked at Ayana, who stood quietly with her chin raised and shoulders straight. "Your daughter," she said with obvious skepticism. "Since when?" "Since she needed a father and I needed a daughter," Thomas replied calmly. "Now, we need 20 pounds of flour, 10 pounds of sugar, and whatever mail might be waiting. While they waited for their supplies, Dr. Samuel Morrison approached with a concerned expression. Morrison was one of the few college-educated men in the territory, and Thomas had always found him more open-minded than most townspeople. "Thomas," Morrison said quietly, "I hope you know what you are doing. There are people in this town who will not take kindly to this arrangement." Thomas looked down at Ayanna, who was studying a display of ribbon with focused attention. "I know exactly what I am doing, Sam. I'm raising a child who needed a home, same as any decent person would do." Morrison glanced around, then leaned closer. "It is not that simple, and you know it. There are legal complications, social complications. People are going to say things." Thomas felt his patience wearing thin. Let them say whatever they want. That girl has more character and intelligence than half the adults in this town combined. As they were leaving, Ayanna surprised everyone by stopping and turning back toward Mrs. Henderson. "Thank you for the supplies, ma'am," she said in her clear, melodic voice. "I hope you have a pleasant day." The simple courtesy, delivered with genuine sincerity, left Mrs. Henderson speechless and earned Ayanna several approving nods from other customers who witnessed the exchange. The ride home was quiet for the first few miles, with Ayanna seeming lost in thought. Finally, she spoke, her voice thoughtful and mature beyond her years. "They are afraid," she said, "not angry. Afraid." Thomas glanced at her in surprise. "What makes you say that?" "My grandmother taught me to read faces and voices. She said understanding what people really feel, not just what they say, is the key to surviving among them. Those people in the store, they are afraid of what they do not understand." Thomas recognized the truth in her insight. Fear was indeed at the root of most prejudice. "You are very wise for someone so young. What else did your grandmother teach you?" Ayanna smiled, the first completely unguarded smile he had seen from her. "She taught me that patience can change hearts that arguments cannot touch, and that the best way to prove people wrong about you is to live a life that makes their opinions look foolish." Thomas felt deep respect for the woman who had raised this remarkable child. "Your grandmother sounds like she was very special." "She was," Ayanna replied softly. "She used to say that every person we meet is fighting a battle we know nothing about, and that kindness is the only weapon that makes everyone stronger." That evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, Ayanna asked a question that went straight to the heart of their relationship. "Thomas, what made you decide to help me? You could have chased me away, or ignored me, or turned me over to the authorities. Why did you not?" Thomas was quiet for a long moment. "I suppose it was because you reminded me of something I had forgotten." "What was that?" Thomas looked at the girl beside him, her dark eyes reflecting the last light of day. "You reminded me that the best parts of being human have nothing to do with where we come from or what we look like. They have to do with how we treat each other when no one is watching, and whether we choose kindness or cruelty when both options are available." Ayanna nodded, as if she understood exactly what he meant. "My grandmother used to say that we are all just walking each other home. I think maybe that is what families really are." Thomas felt tears prick his eyes as he realized how profoundly this child had changed his understanding of what mattered in life. "I think your grandmother was right about a lot of things." As months passed, Thomas and Ayanna settled into a routine that felt natural as breathing. She proved an eager student, quickly learning to read and write with a hunger for knowledge that amazed her adoptive father. Thomas learned from her about tracking animals, reading weather signs, and understanding the subtle communications between all living things. The townspeople of Willowbrook gradually grew accustomed to seeing them together, though acceptance came slowly and was far from universal. Some, like Dr. Morrison and schoolteacher Miss Crawford, made genuine efforts to welcome Ayanna and judge her by her character rather than her heritage. Others remained hostile, whispering behind their backs and making disapproval known through pointed silences and cold stares. The real test came during the harsh winter that followed Ayanna's arrival. A series of brutal storms swept through the territory, bringing temperatures that froze water pipes and snowdrifts that made travel nearly impossible. Several ranchers lost cattle to the cold, and 2 families in town found themselves in desperate straits when food supplies ran low. It was Ayana who suggested they organize a relief effort, using her knowledge of winter survival and Thomas's connections in the community to help their neighbors weather the crisis. She showed them how to preserve meat using traditional Apache methods, how to find edible plants even in winter, and how to construct shelters that would protect livestock from the worst storms. By the time spring arrived, Thomas and Ayana had not only survived their first winter together, but had earned the grudging respect of many people who had initially opposed their arrangement. The girl's knowledge and generosity had helped save lives and property, proving beyond doubt that her value to the community had nothing to do with her racial background. The transformation in both their lives was remarkable. Thomas rediscovered a sense of purpose and joy that he had thought was lost forever, while Ayana blossomed from a frightened, traumatized child into a confident young woman who moved easily between 2 cultures. She maintained her Apache identity and traditions, but also embraced opportunities that came with her new life, excelling in her studies and developing friendships with some of the other young people in the area. Years passed, and the story of the rancher who took in the Apache girl became part of local legend. Travelers and new settlers often heard the tale, usually told with admiration for both Thomas's courage in defying social conventions and Ayana's grace in winning over a community that had initially rejected her. When Ayana turned 18, she faced a choice that would define the rest of her life. She had received offers to attend college in California, opportunities that would have been unimaginable for an Apache girl just a few years earlier. She had also attracted the attention of several young men who recognized her beauty, intelligence, and strength of character. Thomas made it clear that whatever she chose, she would have his full support. In the end, Ayana chose to stay in Arizona, but not as the isolated, fearful girl she had once been. She married Dr. Morrison's son, James, a kind and educated man who had fallen in love with her intelligence and compassion as much as her beauty. Together, they established a school that served both Apache children from the reservation and settler children from surrounding ranches, creating a place where different cultures could learn from each other, rather than fear what they did not understand. Thomas walked his daughter down the aisle at her wedding, his chest swelling with pride as he saw the faces of everyone who had gathered to celebrate this union. Many of the same people who had once whispered "savage" behind her back now smiled with genuine affection and respect. Mrs. Henderson had even contributed flowers from her garden for the ceremony. During the reception, Dr. Morrison approached Thomas with a thoughtful expression. "You know, Thomas, when you first brought that girl to town, I thought you were making a terrible mistake. I was wrong about a lot of things back then." Thomas smiled, his eyes never leaving his daughter as she danced with her new husband. "We all were, Sam, but that is the beautiful thing about people. We can learn, we can grow, we can become better than we were." Morrison raised his glass in a toast. "To second chances, and to the courage to see past our own prejudices. To family," Thomas replied, clinking his glass against Morrison's, "in all its forms." Urbains, as the evening wore on, Thomas found himself standing alone on the porch, looking up at the same stars that had witnessed his first meeting with Ayana. The girl who had been called Savage had become a teacher, a wife, and a bridge between 2 worlds that had once seemed impossibly divided. Ayana appeared at his side, still wearing her wedding dress, but with her shoes in her hand and hair slightly mussed from dancing. She looked exactly as she had when she was 11 years old and trying to decide whether to trust a lonely rancher with her life. "What are you thinking about?" she asked, settling onto the porch railing beside him. Thomas considered the question carefully. "I'm thinking about how much can change when one person decides to see another person as they really are, instead of as they are supposed to be." Ayana smiled, the same radiant expression that had melted his heart on that first night by the spring. My grandmother used to say that every person is like a seed. They carry within them everything they need to become something beautiful, but they need the right soil and the right care to grow. Thomas felt tears gathering as he realized how perfectly her grandmother's wisdom applied to both of them. Ayana had needed a safe place to grow into the remarkable woman she was meant to be, but he had needed her just as much, needed her wisdom and courage and love to help him become the man he was meant to be. "Your grandmother was a very wise woman," he said. "I wish I could have met her." Ayana reached over and took his weathered hand in her smooth young one. "You did meet her. Every lesson she taught me, every value she instilled in me, every bit of love she gave me, that all lived on in how I was able to love you back. She has been with us this whole time." Thomas squeezed her hand, understanding that family was not just about blood or legal documents or social conventions. Family was about choosing to love someone completely, to see their potential even when they could not see it themselves, and to stand by them through whatever challenges life might bring. "Thank you," Thomas said quietly, "for giving an old rancher the chance to be a father." Ayana leaned her head against his shoulder, just as she had done as a child when thunderstorms frightened her. "Thank you for seeing a daughter when everyone else saw a savage." They sat together in comfortable silence, father and daughter, watching the stars wheel overhead and listening to the sounds of celebration from within. In the distance, a nightbird called out across the desert, its voice carrying on the warm wind. It was the same desert that had once seemed so hostile and unforgiving, but now it felt like home to both of them, a place where love had triumphed over fear and where two lost souls had found each other when they needed it most. As the night grew later and guests began saying their goodbyes, Thomas and Ayana remained on the porch, reluctant to let go of this perfect moment when everything felt exactly as it should be. "I have something for you," Ayana said, reaching into a small beaded bag. She pulled out a familiar object that made Thomas's breath catch. The first gift she had ever given him, the tiny woven basket with the 3 white stones and eagle feather. "I want you to keep this," she said, pressing it into his hands, "so you will always remember that sometimes the most beautiful things come from the most unlikely places." Thomas held the delicate basket carefully, remembering the morning he had found it by the spring, and realized the frightened child living in the wilderness was trying to communicate through the language of kindness. "I could never forget," he said. "You changed my life in ways I am still discovering." Ayana stood and smoothed down her wedding dress, preparing to rejoin her husband and begin the next chapter of her life. But before she went inside, she turned back to Thomas with one final thought. "You know, I used to think that losing my original family was the worst thing that could ever happen to me, but now I understand that it was not an ending at all. It was just the beginning of a different kind of story, one that turned out to be more beautiful than anything I could have imagined." Thomas rose and pulled his daughter into a gentle embrace, holding her close and marveling at the strength and wisdom she had developed over the years. When they finally separated, he looked into her dark eyes and saw not the frightened child he had first encountered, but a confident woman who carried within her the best of both cultures, the love of 2 families and the courage to build bridges wherever she went. "Go dance with your husband," he said with a smile. "But remember, no matter how far life takes you, you will always have a home at the ranch. And you will always have a daughter who loves you more than words can say." She disappeared back into the hall, leaving Thomas alone with his memories and profound gratitude for the unexpected gift that had changed everything. As he prepared to follow her inside, he took one last look at the desert landscape that had brought them together, and he offered a silent prayer of thanks to Ayana's grandmother, whose wisdom and love had shaped the remarkable young woman who had given his life new meaning. In the years that followed, as Ayana and James raised their own children and continued their work bringing education and understanding to their community, Thomas often reflected on the simple truth that had guided his decision to help a frightened child by a desert spring, that the measure of a person's worth had nothing to do with the color of their skin or the circumstances of their birth, and everything to do with the contents of their heart. The girl they had once called Savage had become a teacher, a mother, a leader, and living proof that when love replaces fear, when understanding replaces prejudice, and when courage replaces cowardice, the most extraordinary transformations become possible. She had taken the name Ayanna McKinnon Morrison, carrying forward the love of all the families who had shaped her, and in doing so, she had created something entirely new, a legacy of hope that would inspire generations to come. Thomas McKinnon, the lonely rancher who had once thought his life was over, discovered that sometimes the greatest adventures begin not when we are young and fearless, but when we are old enough to recognize love when it appears in unexpected forms, and wise enough to embrace it completely, regardless of what others might think or say. The story of the rancher and the girl called Savage became more than just local legend. It became a testament to the power of seeing people as they truly are, rather than as we expect them to be, and to the miraculous things that can happen when we choose love over fear, understanding over prejudice, and family over convention. In a harsh land where survival often depended on suspicion and self-protection, they had proven that the greatest strength came not from walls and weapons, but from opening hearts and homes to those who needed them most. Years later, when visitors would ask about the beautiful Apache woman who ran the most successful school in the territory and how she had come to marry into one of the most respected families in the region, the old-timers would smile and begin the story the same way every time. Well, it all started when a rancher took in a girl they called Savage and gave her a family instead.